In the Bahamas, we have what we call the Westminster form of government, which is really a kind of cabinet government, meaning that the direction and control of the government rest with a group of persons we call cabinet ministers, headed by the Prime Minister, who is what you might call the supreme among equals, the chairman of the board, and who in fact makes the appointment of ministers. Ministers can be of two types, really. You might even say three types. You can have a minister with portfolio, meaning that you have a minister who exercises jurisdiction over a particular ministry and has overall and ultimate accountability and responsibility for that ministry. But you might also have in that same ministry a minister of state, who would be a minister without portfolio. And typically a minister without portfolio, a minister of state, would have responsibility for a particular department or a particular area of a ministry and would be accountable to a senior minister or a minister with portfolio. And then you have what we might call a junior minister in the form of a parliamentary secretary. And that person might have even more particular responsibility for an area of a ministry. And again, the parliamentary secretary, like the minister of state, would be responsible for to the senior minister or the minister with portfolio. In our system of government, largely ministers, once they have been appointed, carry out the policy directives of the government. They ensure that the ministry is pursuing at all times the directions, the programs, the policies, the legislative agendas that have been set by the government as a whole. And so the Prime Minister would look to those ministers to actually bring about the results of any manifesto promises that they would have made to the people of the country in the campaigning leading up to election. Now, in the Bahamas, we have elections every 5 years. They're mandated by the Constitution to take place every 5 years. And when that time arises, there would be a proroguing of the House, which means that, in effect, the House dissolves itself, and all seats in the House become essentially vacant. And by House, I mean the House of Assembly. Once the House would have been prorogued, and you would have had the writ issued by the Governor General declaring the date of an election, you would have a process then of candidate selection and nomination, and then that day when all of these persons would then go before the electorate for selection or election to the House of Assembly. In our country, the leader of the party with the most members elected to the House of Assembly becomes the Prime Minister. And so essentially the party with the most members elected to the House of Assembly becomes the governing party, and would then take direction and control of the government. And again, that happens every 5 years. Of course, you can have an election call prior to the 5 years, and in fact, you can have an election call after the 5-year period up to, I think, about 90 days. And here in this country, we have been among the most exemplary democracies you can find. Not only do we have an enduring democracy more than 275 years old, but we also have a democracy where the voter registration rate exceeds some 95%. And typically, voter turnout and participation is in the vicinity of 90%. Now, that is essentially, that is an immaculate record compared to some of the more established democracies in the world. For instance, in the United States of America, you have, during presidential elections, less than 50% of the eligible voters who actually register to vote. And of those who actually register to vote, you have anywhere around 25% who, or half of those who actually vote. So essentially 25% of the eligible voters of the country actually elect their presidents. Compare that to the 90% electoral participation that we have in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. It is by far an exemplary democracy, participation rate-wise, when you look at it from that point of view. And we have been fortunate in that every election contested in the country has been without violence and with smooth and peaceful transition from one government to the next. Our parliamentary system really is what we call bicameral. You have an upper house called the Senate, and then you have a lower house called the House of Assembly. Now, really the sovereignty of the country vests in the House of Assembly. The Senate, which is a non-elected but appointed group of persons, is really more of a symbolic institution than it is an institution with what we might call real power, because in many instances the Senate really, in consideration of bills for legislation, doesn't really have the power to prevent a bill from actually being passed. It can amend it and refer it back to the House of Assembly, but essentially in the end it has to really pass the bill. And when it comes, for instance, to even money bills, the Senate doesn't have the power to initiate any such bill. And so in many respects, while it is a body that is honored in the country, the Senate itself is not a powerful body. And the appointments to the Senate are made in the first instance by the Prime Minister, who would appoint the majority of members, and then in the second instance by the leader of the opposition, who would appoint a number of members, and then some members are appointed jointly by the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition, consulting with each other. What is supposed to happen is that the mix in the Senate is supposed to reflect the proportionate distribution of seats in the House of Assembly, so that if you have 60% of this seats in the House of Assembly held by the governing party, then 60% of the senators ought to be appointed by the Prime Minister, and so forth. And so it creates for an interesting parliamentary dynamics.